Hello guys, welcome back to this tutorial. In this tutorial, we are going to discuss some of the best practices that you need to follow when you are coding. So the first thing that you need to remember is you need bulkify your code. That is the number one best practice. What do you mean by bulkify your code? So bulkify your code means make sure that the code you are writing should be able to handle more than one record at a time. You should make sure that the code that you have written works on or handles more than one record at a time. When you're applying that logic on multiple records, it should work. It should not give any error if you are using that code for more than one record. The next important thing is avoid writing the SQL queries inside of for loop. And I probably have repeated in my reason is if you write that, let's say the query is to update a record, and if you have written that update query inside of for loop, what will happen is for the number of time the loop is going to run, the same number of time you are going to run your query. And what might happen is you might end up running, then let's say you are running a for loop which runs for about 50,000 records. Then what happens is you are running 50,000 times that query, which is not required. So what you should do is instead of writing your query inside a for loop, you should write the query outside the loop. And either you can just pass the records that you want to update, or if you're trying to retrieve records, then try to do that in one go rather than doing multiple queries, or you can retrieve all the necessary data in the single query. Or if even if you're updating records, then do not update one record at a time. Try to update a list of records at a time so that you do not run a query multiple times. So try to avoid writing your SQL queries inside of a for loop. Then the third important best practice is you should follow is avoid writing multiple triggers on the same object. So there is no point of writing 4 or 5 triggers for an account object. It is not a best practice. Sooner or later you will encounter some issues with that. So how you're going to handle the complexity, or what about the business logic? If you want to do different things, how you can handle in writing a single trigger? The way you handle is like whatever the logic you want to do, you write them in your Apex classes. And then from the trigger based upon different scenarios, you can call that Apex class code. So you are going to end up writing only one trigger per object, but through the trigger based upon different conditions or different business scenarios, you can call the different Apex classes. So that way per object, you only have one trigger, but you have multiple classes to handle the different scenarios. And then you can call those classes from your trigger. So that is another very important best practices. The reason you should follow these practices is down the line. You will avoid hitting errors or avoid hitting governor limits if you follow these best practices. From the very beginning, you will encounter less issues. You will run into less problems. If you do not follow these best practices, your code might work, but sooner or later it will break if you are not handling or if you are not following these practices. So try using these practices and always keep these best practices in mind when you are writing the code. So the first thing is you should always design or write your code which can handle more than one record at a time. Second is do not write SOQL queries inside a for loop. Third is try to make one trigger per object. Do not make multiple triggers for the same object. Then the fourth thing is use of the limits inside of the Apex method so you can avoid hitting the governor limits. If you limit, you will not hit your governor limit. So you have to use limits Apex method to avoid hitting the governor limits. And then the fifth important best practice, and I think you should know by now, is you should not hard code anything. You should avoid hard coding the IDs because let's say later on, if you want to change the ID, you will end up coming back to the code and making a change there. So the most important, the fifth point is avoid hard coding IDs inside of your code. So these are some of the best practices. Sometimes interviews wants to know that how good you are as a programmer or as a designer. So he might ask you about, hey, what kind of practices do you follow while writing your code? So you can say this, I will try to avoid queries inside of the loop. I try to write a code which can handle more than one record at a time. I think that hey, this particular piece of code will not be called for one record at a time. It might be called for multiple records. So I try to design my code according to that. I will focus on writing one particular trigger for one particular object. So I try to avoid writing multiple triggers for the same object. So you can use one of these or two of these best practices from this presentation and you can speak on that in the interview. So I hope you like this and I will happy to help if you have any questions regarding this best practices. Thank you and I will see you in the next tutorial. Bye.